The gun was already pressed to Julia Rhodes's chest before she had time to draw a single breath. She stood in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas's only general store, her black widow's dress pressed flat against the wooden counter behind her, and she stared into the bloodshot eyes of Harlan Pruitt like she was staring into the mouth of everything she had been running from. The store around them had gone silent. The other customers, two ranch hands and old Mrs. Farley with her basket of thread, had backed themselves into the corners like frightened animals. Dust hung in the summer air. The clock on the wall ticked with horrible, indifferent regularity. "You think I don't know who you are?" Harlan said. His voice was a low, dragging thing soaked in whiskey and something darker beneath it. "You think you can come rolling into Caldwell with your widow's veil and your pretty face and nobody's going to put two and two together?" Julia did not move. She had learned in the past year that stillness was armor, that if you gave a dangerous man nothing to chase, sometimes he would exhaust himself on his own fire. "I don't know what you believe you know about me," she said. Her voice was even, steady. She had paid an enormous price for that steadiness. "Your husband," Harlan said, jamming the barrel harder against her sternum, "owed my brother a debt. And now your husband's dead and buried, and you're standing here in Caldwell buying flour like nothing happened, and I'm here to collect what's owed." The door to the general store swung open, so hard it struck the wall. Lewis Conroy filled the doorframe the way storm clouds fill the horizon, completely, suddenly, with the kind of authority that made every eye in the room swing toward him before his boots had even cleared the threshold. He was tall and broad-shouldered, sun-darkened, with a jaw set like quarried stone and eyes that moved across the room with the swift, assessing calm of a man who had spent 15 years reading dangerous situations on the open range. He took in the scene: Harlan, the gun, Julia's white-knuckled grip on the counter behind her in less than 2 seconds. "Harlan," Lewis said, and his voice was almost conversational. "Almost. Put the gun down. Stay out of this, Conroy. I'm already in it." He stepped forward, his boots deliberate on the wooden floor. "You've got a gun on a woman in a public establishment in my town. You're already in it with me." Something fractured in the moment. Harlan's eyes cut sideways. That was all it took. Julia moved, her hand finding the glass jar of nails on the counter behind her by instinct, and she swung it hard into Harlan's gun hand. The weapon discharged into the ceiling with a crack that sent plaster raining down. Lewis crossed the room in 4 strides and had Harlan pinned face down on the floorboards before the dust had even settled. Julia stood with the jar still in her hand, breathing hard for the first time. Lewis looked up at her from where he knelt on Harlan's back, one hand twisting the man's arm at an angle that made compliance the only rational option. He studied her face the way a careful man studies a ledger, looking for the truth beneath the surface numbers. "You all right?" he asked. Julia set the jar down on the counter with a precise, controlled click. "I've had worse mornings," she said. And that was how it began. She had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas on the 9th of June, 1878, on the afternoon stage from Wichita, with 2 leather trunks, $43, and a secret she was not yet sure she could trust anyone in the world to hold for her. The town of Caldwell sat hard on the Kansas Indian Territory border, and in 1878 it was very much still a town in the process of deciding what it wanted to be. The cattle trade ran through it like a river of money and violence. The Kishom Trail ended its long northward push at Caldwell stockyards, and every spring and summer the streets filled with Texas drovers, buyers from Kansas City, land agents, and the inevitable tide of gamblers and opportunists who followed wherever money moved. It had a newspaper, 3 saloons, 2 churches, a doctor who'd trained in Cincinnati, and a sheriff who'd trained in the hardest possible school there was, which was experience itself. Julia had chosen Caldwell deliberately. She had stood in the small, airless room of a boarding house in Wichita and spread her remaining options before her like cards in a hand of poker, and she had made the only reasonable choice. A town large enough for a widow to find work without being stared at too hard, and far enough from Missouri that certain names and certain histories would not follow her as quickly. Her husband, Thomas Rhodes, had been dead for 7 months. She was 28 years old. She had no children and no family that was willing to claim her, and approximately $43 standing between her and catastrophe. Thomas had left behind debts she had not known about, a pattern of borrowing and promising and dealing that had unraveled in spectacular fashion in the months after his death, and she had learned more about the man she had married at 23 than she had ever managed to learn during the 5 years she had actually been married to him. The hidden debts were the first betrayal. The second had been learning the nature of those debts, the men Thomas had borrowed from, the dark corners of commerce he had navigated. The third had been the letter which had arrived a week after his funeral, addressed to Thomas but opened by necessity, which had made clear that at least 2 men believed they had claims on Thomas Rhodes's estate and intended to collect from whatever source remained available. Julia had packed her trunks that same evening. She had not run. She told herself this carefully and deliberately, as a woman establishes the terms of her own survival. She had not run. She had made a strategic relocation to more favorable terrain. It was a distinction that mattered to her, even if no one else in the world was available to appreciate it. Caldwell's Main Street was a long, wide dirt avenue that turned to mud in rain and cracked like old pottery in the sun, and it smelled of horse and cattle, and the particular sweet rot of dried grass that the Kansas wind carried in from the prairies on every side. Julia had stepped down from the stage, straightened her back, taken stock of the street before her, and walked into the first business that looked like it had enough activity to suggest it might be hiring, which turned out to be the general store owned by a man named Edwin Barker, who was 53, nearsighted, honest to a fault, and desperately in need of someone who could keep accounts. She had been working for Edwin Barker for 6 days when Harlan Pruitt walked in with his gun, and his accusations, and his dead brother's grievances. After Lewis Conroy had marched Harlan down to the sheriff's office, and she had given her account of the events, and Edwin Barker had pressed a cup of weak coffee into her hands, and told her 3 times that she was a remarkable woman. After all of that, Julia walked back to the narrow room she rented at Mrs. Edna Dalloway's boarding house on Chestnut Street, sat down on the edge of the bed, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of shaking. Then she stopped, because the shaking was a luxury she could not afford, and she had long since learned to budget her indulgences with ruthless precision. She thought about the man who had walked through that door, Lewis Conroy. She had seen him before that morning, in the way you see people in a small town across the width of the street, through the window of the store. He was not a man you failed to notice, not because he was theatrical about himself, but precisely because he was not. He moved through Caldwell without swagger and without apology, greeting people with a minimal nod, conducting his business with the efficient directness of a man who had too much actual work to do to spend time on performance. She had heard Edwin Barker mention his name twice in conversation, once in connection with the largest cattle operation in Comanche County, and once in connection with a dispute over grazing rights that had apparently been resolved in Lewis Conroy's favor through the simple mechanism of Lewis Conroy being correct. What she had not expected was the way he had looked at her after it was over, not with pity, not with the particular brand of masculine relief that men sometimes showed when they felt they had rescued something. He had looked at her with assessment, and beneath that, something she could only describe as recognition, as though he had been watching for someone who would hit back, and he had found her. She told herself it did not matter. She was in Caldwell to establish herself, to earn enough money to build a foundation under her feet that no man's debts could pull out from under her again. She was not in Caldwell to be noticed by anyone. The following morning she was back at her post behind Edwin Barker's counter, tallying the previous week's accounts in the ledger with the precise, slightly aggressive handwriting that had been the one skill her schooling had genuinely delivered to her, when the bell above the door announced a customer, and she looked up to find Lewis Conroy standing 3 feet away from her with a list in his hand and an expression of careful neutrality on his face. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "What can I help you with?" He set the list on the counter. It was written in a clean, angular hand: flour, salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, fence staples, a ball of twine. The practical inventory of a working cattle operation. She filled the order with swift efficiency, and when she looked up to tell him the total, she found him watching her with that same quality of attention she had noticed the day before: concentrated, unperformative, genuinely focused. "I wanted to check that you were managing all right," he said. "After yesterday." "I am managing perfectly well, thank you." "Harlan Pruitt has a reputation for following through on things he starts," he said. "I spoke with Sheriff Donahue this morning. Harlan's being held for the time being, but he has friends in the territory who will post his bond within the week. You should be aware of that." Julia looked at him steadily. "I appreciate the warning. Do you have anyone here in Caldwell?" "I have myself," she said. "That's been sufficient so far." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile. "Fair enough," he said. He paid for his goods, loaded them into his wagon with a quiet competence that she watched through the window without meaning to, and drove away south along the main road without looking back. She turned back to her ledger and found, with some irritation, that she had lost her place. His name, she learned from the various conversational tributaries that flowed through Edwin Barker's store, was Lewis Conroy. He was 34 years old. He had come to Kansas from Texas 12 years ago with nothing but a horse and a credit line he had worked himself nearly to death to repay. And he now ran the Conroy Cattle Company from a ranch 12 miles south of Caldwell that comprised 4,000 acres of prime grassland, and a herd that the county's best estimate put it somewhere between 8 and 1,200 head of Texas longhorn cattle. He had done all of this alone. He had never married. He was not, as far as Caldwell could determine, a man who spent much time on personal distractions. What Caldwell also said, in the way that small towns say things between the lines of other conversations, in the significant pauses between sentences, was that Lewis Conroy was a man of his word in a landscape where that was not guaranteed, that he paid his workers fairly and kept them longer than most ranchers did, and that 3 years ago he had quietly financed the repair of the Methodist church's roof without taking any credit for it, and only 2 people in town knew it had been him. Julia heard this last detail from Mrs. Dalloway herself, who had a way of deploying information about local figures as though she were placing tiles in a mosaic. "Of course he's not an easy man," Mrs. Dalloway added, with the air of someone offering a necessary qualification. "He keeps himself to himself. There have been women who have tried to draw him out and found it harder work than they expected, but he's a good man. There aren't as many of those as people pretend." "I'm not in the market," Julia said pleasantly and went back to her mending. Mrs. Dalloway said nothing to this, which was the most expressive response available to her. 2 weeks passed. Harlan Pruitt's bond was posted, as Lewis had warned, and he left town in the company of 2 men Julia did not recognize but whose posture and bearing she classified immediately as the kind that meant trouble of a structured, professional variety. She mentioned this to Sheriff Donahue, who listened to her with the genuine attention of a man who respected accurate information, told her he'd put word out along the territory border, and suggested she make herself known to the people around her so that she was not in a position of isolation. She was not, she reflected, used to being genuinely listened to. It surprised her each time it happened in Caldwell, which had been, so far, more often than she had expected. Lewis Conroy came into the store every 10 days or so. She began to recognize the pattern. He would come in, set his list on the counter, she would fill it, they would exchange several sentences that were technically about practical matters but carried on both sides a weight of interest that neither of them acknowledged, and he would pay and leave. Each time he came in he stayed slightly longer than he had the time before. This was not something Julia was tracking, she told herself, and yet somehow she was always aware of exactly how long it had been since the last time. On his fourth visit, he said, without any particular preamble, "I heard you've been teaching Mrs. Barker's girls their arithmetic." "They needed it," Julia said. "Mr. Barker's wife mentioned the school here is understaffed and the girls were falling behind. I offered to help in the evenings." "You could teach at the school." "I could," she agreed. "Mr. Barker needs me in the mornings and the afternoons, so evenings are what I can offer. It suits everyone for now." "You're good with numbers," he said. It was an observation, not flattery. "Numbers don't lie," she said. "I find that refreshing." He looked at her for a moment with that careful, focused attention. "Most people find it impersonal." "Most people find honesty impersonal," she said. "That says more about most people than it does about numbers." There was a pause, and in it something shifted. Some small interior door that had been held closed by mutual agreement swung slightly open on its hinges. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked. "At the hotel dining room, Saturday." She held the question for a moment. It was, she knew, a decision of a particular weight. She was a widow of 7 months. She was in a town where she was still building her reputation. She had not, in the 7 months since Thomas's death, thought of herself as someone who would be asked this question and might want to say yes. But she did want to say yes. That was the thing she had not been prepared for. "Saturday," she said. "Yes." The hotel dining room was the closest thing Caldwell had to formal elegance: white tablecloths that were genuinely white, a menu that ran to 4 items, and candles in glass holders that cast the kind of light that made the rough edges of the frontier town seem, briefly, very far away. Julia wore the dark blue wool dress that was the only thing she owned that was not either black or purely functional, and she arrived 2 minutes early because she had learned, long ago, that punctuality was the most basic form of self-respect. Lewis was already there. He had made a visible effort: a pressed shirt, a coat that fit his broad shoulders without strain, his hair combed back with the slight stiffness of a man who did not normally tend to such things. He stood when she came in, which was a courtesy she had not expected from a cattle rancher and which moved her more than she would have liked. "You look very well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They sat and ordered and began the careful process of actual conversation, the kind that moves past the surface logistics of daily life and into the territory of real things. It was slower than she expected and more comfortable. He was not a man who filled silence with noise, which meant the things he did say carried specific weight. He asked her about Missouri, where she said she was from, before the marriage, and listened to her answers with the focused attention that was his characteristic mode. He told her about Texas, about the years he had spent working cattle drives north before he had saved enough to stake his own operation, about the failures that had preceded the success. "The first winter I nearly lost everything," he said. "I lost 40 head in a blizzard in January of '68. I was in debt to 3 different men, and I had 6 hands who were depending on their pay, and I walked out of that winter not entirely sure I was going to be able to keep going." "But you did." "I did." He turned his glass slowly on the tablecloth. "There's a particular thing that happens when you've already lost enough that the fear of losing more stops working as it's supposed to. You get past a certain threshold of catastrophe, and it becomes almost clarifying." Julia looked at him across the table. "Yes," she said quietly, "I know that feeling." Something in his expression acknowledged the weight of what she had said without pressing on it. He understood she was not going to say more, and he did not ask. By the end of dinner they had been talking for 2 hours, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she had been fully present in a conversation, not managing it from behind glass, not measuring what she gave away, but actually there. It was both wonderful and alarming. He walked her back to Mrs. Dalloway's in the warm evening, the street quieter now, the sound of the saloons a distant undertone. At the gate he stopped and looked at her with an expression that was very direct. "I'd like to call on you again," he said. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded as though this were a matter settled. "Good night, Mrs. Rhodes." "Good night, Mr. Conroy." She went inside, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the street below and thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she was going to have to tell him. Not everything, not yet, but the essential shape of the truth, the debts, the dangerous men, the things she had been carrying alone since she had packed her trunks and left Missouri. She could not let him invest his interest in her without knowing what that interest was walking into. The question was when, and the question was how, and beneath both of those questions was the oldest, most treacherous fear. Not that he would be angry, but that he would simply step back, with the controlled politeness of a man who had too much sense to walk into someone else's catastrophe. She pushed the fear down. She had not survived the past 7 months by giving way to fear. He came to call 2 days later, on Monday evening, and they walked along the less busy side of Chestnut Street and talked about the cattle market and the weather and the particular problem of water rights on the southern range of his property. It was practical, grounded conversation, and Julia engaged with it genuinely. She had always had a mind for the structural problems of land and money, which was something Thomas had found amusing in a woman and Lewis Conroy seemed to find simply useful. He explained the water rights dispute with the precision of someone who had studied the problem deeply, and when she asked a question that cut to the center of the legal issue, he stopped walking and looked at her. "Have you had any legal training?" He asked. "No," she said. "I read everything I could find when my husband was dealing with the estate matters, and property law is not as incomprehensible as people allow others to believe it is." "You read the legal documents yourself," he said. Who else was going to? He was quiet for a moment, and she understood that he was recalibrating something, not lowering his assessment of her, but raising it, adjusting the architecture of his understanding. "The water rights issue comes down to prior appropriation," she said. "Kansas has followed the prior appropriation doctrine since statehood. If you established use before your neighbor, the law is on your side. Do you have documentation of when you first drew from that source?" "I have the original survey from '68, he said, with a slight note of wonder in his voice. "Then you have your case," she said simply. He looked at her for another moment. Then he laughed, not the polite social laugh of dinner-table conversation, but a genuine thing, low and surprised and warm. She found it had a startling effect on the region of her chest. The weeks that followed moved with a rhythm that she had not been expecting, the rhythm of something building. He called on her twice a week, sometimes 3 times. They walked, they talked. They had dinner at the hotel twice more, and once at the home of his ranch foreman, Ben Alcott, and his wife Clara, who was direct and funny and looked at Julia with the specific expression of a woman who has been hoping for this development for a long time and is careful not to say so out loud. The Alcotts had 2 sons, both in school, and a house that was full of the particular comfortable noise of a family that was genuinely glad to be itself. And Julia sat at their table and felt something move through her that she could only name as longing, not desperate longing, but the quiet, certain kind that knows what it wants. She was falling in love with Lewis Conroy. She knew it with the same clarity that she recognized a mathematical truth, not as a discovery of something new, but as the acknowledgement of something that had been true for longer than she had wanted to admit. It was the way he listened. It was the way he told her things about his land and his cattle with the transparent enthusiasm of a man who had never had someone he genuinely wanted to share those things with. It was the way he was always, without making a performance of it, between her and any possible threat, not from protectiveness that erased her agency, but from a quality of attention that was so consistently, quietly alert to her safety that she had begun to feel, for the first time in years, something that might be trust. She had to tell him. She chose a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into what she had privately begun to call their courtship, though neither of them had used the word. They were sitting on the bench outside Mrs. Dalloway's front gate in the last light of the evening, the sky above the Kansas prairie gone orange and gold, and there was a silence between them that was comfortable enough to make what she was about to do all the harder. "I need to tell you something," she said. He turned to look at her, and his expression was very steady. He had known, she realized, that this was coming. He had been patient enough not to push, but he had known there was something she had been holding in reserve. She told him. She told him about Thomas's debts, the full scope of them, not the edited version she had given people who had asked. She told him about the men Thomas had borrowed from, and the nature of that borrowing, which had involved, in at least 2 instances, arrangements that were on the wrong side of legal. She told him that the men she was in debt to by virtue of being Thomas's widow and the only remaining asset were not the kind of men who accepted a ledger entry written off. She told him that Harlan Prout was one of 3 different men who had legitimate grievances of a financial variety against Thomas's estate, and that she had left Missouri not as a woman fleeing her past, but as a woman trying to get ahead of it long enough to build something that could not be pulled out from under her. She told him that she was not, as far as she could determine, directly implicated in anything Thomas had done. She had not known, but she understood that this was not, for the men involved, a meaningful distinction. She told him all of this, and then she stopped and looked at the orange-gold sky and waited. Lewis was quiet for a long time. Not an uncomfortable silence, a thinking silence, the kind that a man makes when he is taking something seriously rather than dismissing it. "How much is the total debt?" he asked. She had not expected that to be the first question. "About $640, she said. "Do you have any of it documented, the original agreements?" "Thomas kept some papers. I have them. They were in one of the trunks." "I want to see them," he said. "Lewis, I want to see them," he said again, and there was something in his voice that was neither domineering nor desperate but simply resolved, the voice of a man who has decided on a course of action and is simply announcing it. "This is not your problem," she said. "It became my problem," he said quietly, "the moment I started caring considerably more about what happens to you than I've cared about much else in recent memory." The silence that followed that statement was of an entirely different quality than the one before it. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "You told me now," he said. "That's the thing that counts." He looked at her with those steady eyes that she had come to understand were the most honest part of him. "The secret of yours that I was actually worried about was a different kind, the kind that changes what a person is. This isn't that. This is just a debt. Debts can be managed." She felt something give way inside her, not the collapse of defeat, but the release of something that had been under extraordinary pressure for a very long time. She had not cried in front of another person since the first days after Thomas's death, and she did not cry now, but it was a near thing. "You are a somewhat unexpected man," she said. "I've been told that," he said. And there, again, was that laugh, low and warm and real. He came to the boarding house the following morning with his ranch foreman Ben Alcott, and they sat at Mrs. Dalloway's kitchen table with Julia's documents spread out between them, and went through the papers with the methodical precision of men accustomed to reading contracts. Ben Alcott had more legal knowledge than Julia had expected, which Lewis explained with the brief notation that Ben had worked for a land office in Missouri before he'd come west. The review of the documents took 2 hours and produced a clear picture. Of the 3 claimants, one, a man named Garrett, innocent. Louis had a genuinely documented claim that Julia genuinely owed. The other 2, including the Prout family's claim, were murkier. They were based on arrangements that had been verbal or documented in ways that could be challenged, particularly since Thomas Rhodes had apparently been not entirely honest with any of the parties involved. "The Garrett debt is real and has to be settled," Lewis said. "The other 2 can be contested. Donahue has a contact in Wichita, a lawyer named Marsh who's handled these kinds of territory debt disputes before. I'll write to him today." "You're doing this very fast," Julia said. "Problems don't get smaller by being left alone," he said. He paused and she saw him decide something, And I have another motivation, which is that I would like to be able to pursue a courtship with you without the weight of this hanging over us both. I'd rather deal with it directly and get on with more important matters." She looked at him across the table. "A courtship," she said. "If that's acceptable to you," he said. "It is," she said. "Quite acceptable." Ben Alcott became very interested in a spot on Mrs. Dalloway's tablecloth. The letter went to the lawyer Marsh in Wichita that afternoon. Lewis paid the Garrett debt within the week, not as a gift, he made clear with characteristic directness, but as an advance against the salary he was going to propose to pay her, if she was willing, to handle the Conroy Cattle Company's accounts and purchasing, which were currently managed by Lewis himself in the after-midnight hours when he was too tired to do it well. Julia agreed to this arrangement with the privately understood condition that the advance would be repaid in full before she accepted anything that could be interpreted as charity, and Lewis agreed with the privately understood condition that he intended to make this arrangement entirely unnecessary within a time period he had already calculated, but was not yet going to mention. The lawyer Marsh's response arrived 12 days later. His assessment confirmed what Ben and Lewis had concluded. The Prout claim and the third claim, from a man named Wick who had apparently been one of Thomas's less savory business partners, were both legally vulnerable. Marsh had taken the liberty, at Lewis's request, of writing to both men with a formal challenge to their documentation. The Wick claim was dropped within 2 weeks. The Prout claim was more complicated, but Marsh believed it would not survive a territorial court proceeding, and Harlan Prout, who was not a man who had demonstrated interest in the slow mechanisms of the legal system, eventually and gracelessly let it go. Julia was free of Thomas's debts for the first time since before his death. She stood in Edwin Barker's store after receiving this news and felt the difference in her body, the way you feel the removal of something heavy you have been carrying so long you had stopped noticing the weight. She felt, with startling suddenness, very younger than she had felt in years. She told Lewis that evening and he listened and nodded, and then he said, "I'd like to show you the ranch." "I'd like to see it," she said. He came for her the following Sunday morning with a horse, a quiet bay mare with a steady temperament, and they rode the 12 miles south to the Conroy property together, mostly in a comfortable silence broken by intermittent conversation about the things they passed. The quality of the grass, the state of the fences, the color of the sky over the southern range. Julia had ridden regularly as a girl and had not much sense, but the skill returned quickly, and Lewis noticed this with a look of satisfaction that he managed to keep almost entirely off his face. The ranch was a revelation. Not in the sense of grandeur, though it was a substantial operation, but in the sense that it was unmistakably the work of a specific mind, and will over a long period of time. The main house was large without being ornate, solidly built of stone and timber, with a wide porch and deep windows. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained with the particular quality of care that distinguishes work done out of genuine pride from work done merely to comply with necessity. The cattle that moved across the southern pasture were healthy and fat, the grass good beneath them. Everything about the place said, "Someone has given this their full attention for a very long time." Lewis showed her through it with a quiet pride that he expressed, as was his nature, primarily through careful and specific explanations rather than any kind of display. He knew every part of his land by intimate acquaintance: the spring that ran through the north pasture, the rocky outcrop on the eastern boundary that he had learned to love despite its uselessness, the stand of cottonwood trees along the creek where, he said, the summer heat was reduced to something almost tolerable. They sat in the shade of those cottonwood trees at midday and ate the lunch she had packed in a saddlebag, and the creek ran over its stones nearby with a sound like a conversation in a language she was just on the edge of understanding. "It's a beautiful place," she said. "It's mine," he said. Then, after a pause, "I've never shown it to anyone with the feeling I have showing it to you." She looked at him. He was looking out at the water, and there was an expression on his face she had not seen there before, open in a way he normally held very carefully in check. She understood what it cost him, a man of his particular self-contained nature, to show that openness. "Lewis," she said. He turned to look at her. "I love you," she said, not tentatively, not as a question, as the statement of a fact that she had been ready to say for some time and had simply been waiting for the right moment to say correctly. The expression that moved across his face was one she would spend the rest of her life being grateful she had seen. It was not shock, exactly. It was more the expression of a man who had been hoping for something for so long that he had almost stopped being sure it was possible, and then found it was. He reached out and took her hand in both of his, and held it with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the hard physical labor written into every line of him. "I love you," he said. "I have been loving you since you picked up that jar of nails and swung it at a man twice your size without a single moment's hesitation." He paused. "Possibly before that." She laughed, which was the sound of relief and happiness and the strange lightness of having put down all the weight she had been carrying. He kissed her then, not precipitously, not with the anxious speed of a man who is afraid the moment will close before he gets to it, but with the deliberate, full-present quality that was his nature in everything. And she kissed him back with a certainty that she had never felt about anything in her life as completely as she felt it about this. The proposal came 3 weeks later, which was, Julia reflected, extremely characteristic of Lewis. He had decided what he wanted. He had assessed the situation with thorough care, and when he was confident in his conclusion, he acted on it without unnecessary delay. He came to the boarding house on a Thursday evening, and she met him at the door, and he looked at her for a moment with that direct, steady gaze. "I want you to marry me," he said. "Not because I want to solve your problems or you have nowhere else to go. Those things were true 6 weeks ago, and they're not true anymore. I want to marry you because you are the most uncommon woman I have ever met, and I intend to spend the rest of my life in that company, if you'll have me." She had been ready for this, she realized. She had been ready for it in the way you are ready for something you have been moving toward for months, through every intermediate stage, without letting yourself fully see the destination until you were already almost there. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They were married 6 weeks later, in September of 1878, in the Methodist church, whose roof Lewis had paid to repair, by a minister named Reverend Holloway, who performed the ceremony with the genuine warmth of a man who was happy for the people in front of him. Clara Alcott had insisted on standing up with Julia, and Ben Alcott stood with Lewis, and about half the town of Caldwell was present because the wedding of Lewis Conroy was, by the consensus of everyone who knew him, one of the more surprising and welcome developments in recent Caldwell history. Julia wore a dress of pale gray silk that Mrs. Dalloway had helped her sew over the previous 3 weeks, not white, as she was a widow, but not black either. It was, she had decided, exactly the color of the space between one life and another. She stood at the front of that small church with the late September sunlight coming through the windows, and she looked at Lewis standing beside her, and felt something settle into place in her chest with the definitive, irrevocable solidity of a keystone dropping into an arch. The structure, once completed, was stronger than any of its individual parts. She came to town as a widow. She was leaving as a cattleman's wife. But the full weight of what that meant, the depth of it, the dailiness of it, the extraordinary, ordinary reality of it, she was only beginning to understand. The first year of marriage was the year she learned Lewis Conroy as you learn a place by living in it rather than visiting it, in all weathers, in all lights, in the full complexity of his character, rather than the edited version that courtship presents. What she found was, in its entirety, something she had not dared to hope for but had somehow, against all the evidence of her first marriage, understood was possible. He was not an easy man in the sense of being transparent or uncomplicated. He kept his interior life at a certain depth beneath the surface, accessible but not floating. He could go silent in ways that unnerved people who did not know him. A long, focused quiet that was simply him working through something, not withdrawing or punishing. He worked with a physical commitment to his land that was close to devotional, up before first light, managing the ranch with the hands, and then managing the paperwork with Julia in the evenings. And he carried the weight of the responsibility with a steadiness that she recognized was something he had built in himself through years of practice rather than natural ease. What he was, without complication, was honest. He said what he thought with a directness that she found, every single time, like water after drought. He did not manage her. He did not decide on her behalf and present her with the decision. He brought her into the workings of the ranch from the first week of their marriage as though her partnership in it were a given, and when she had opinions, which was frequently, he engaged with them as opinions worth engaging with, not as decorative contributions to be politely acknowledged. In October, a month after the wedding, she reorganized the Conroy Cattle Company's account system. The previous system, kept by Lewis himself in a series of ledgers that had evolved organically over 12 years, was functional, but had accumulated the inefficiencies of a system managed by a man who was better at cattle than accounting. Julia redesigned it in 2 weeks, working at the kitchen table in the evenings, and when she showed Lewis the result, he studied it for a long time, moving his finger down the columns, and then he looked up at her with an expression of frank and genuine admiration. "This is considerably better than what I had," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I would like to be slightly resentful of how much better it is," he said, "but I find I'm not able to manage it." She laughed, and he smiled. That rare, full smile that she had come to understand was one of the most valuable things he had to give, because it was never performed. In November, the first significant cattle market sale of the season brought in more money than Lewis had projected, partly due to Julia's renegotiation of the terms with the Kansas City buyer, a negotiation she had conducted by written correspondence with a precision that had left the buyer, accustomed to dealing with ranchers who didn't know the market numbers as well as he did, with considerably less leverage than he had expected. Lewis received the final settlement figures and told her with complete seriousness that she had made him more money in a single correspondence than he had made himself in 3 years of that particular arrangement. "You knew the numbers better than he did," she said. "You knew the numbers better than I did," he said. "Well, someone had to," she said, and he laughed again, and she thought, "This is what it was supposed to be. This is the thing I didn't know how to imagine." In December, on a night when the Kansas wind was driving snow sideways past the windows, and the house had that particular sealed warmth of a well-built structure against hard weather, they sat by the fire after supper, and she told him things about her first marriage that she had never told anyone, not because she had been hiding them, but because there had never been anyone she trusted enough to want to tell. She told him about the loneliness of living with a man who was charming to everyone around him and entirely absent from her. She told him about the years of watching Thomas operate with a confident dishonesty that she had managed, for too long, to find reasons to excuse. She told him about the specific texture of grief that followed a death when you were mourning not so much the person as the life you had believed you were living. Lewis listened to all of it without interruption, and without the particular kind of male discomfort that she had been half expecting the impulse to fix or minimize. When she was done, he said, "I want you to know that the things you described being unseen, being managed, being kept at the edge of your own life, none of that will happen here. Not because I'm making you a promise I could break, but because the version of this marriage that would involve any of those things is not a version I'm interested in." She looked at him across the firelight. "I know that," she said. "I've known it for some time." She paused. "That's actually what I was trying to tell you. I'm not telling you about the past because I'm worried about the present. I'm telling you because I have never had anyone to tell, and you are the first person I've trusted enough, and I wanted you to know that. What you've given me, it matters more than I know how to say." He crossed to her chair and knelt down and took both her hands in his, and looked at her with that open expression that she knew was the deepest and most private thing he could offer another person. "You matter more to me than I know how to say either," he said. "But I intend to keep trying." Spring came. The cattle on the South Range calved, and the grass came green and fast across the prairie, and Julia found herself moving through the days of the ranch with a fluency that surprised her. Not just the accounts and the correspondence, but the physical reality of the place, the rhythms of the season, the particular language of the land that Lewis had been speaking for 15 years, and that she was learning with the absorption of someone who had not known, until now, how much she had needed a language like this to live in. She rode out with Lewis on the spring cattle check in April, as she had learned to do, and they moved across the pastures in the early morning with the sky enormous above them and the grass full of birdsong, and she felt the specific happiness of being exactly where she was supposed to be, not arrived at, not achieved, but simply true, like a mathematical proof that has finally resolved itself into elegant simplicity. In May, she told him she was pregnant. He had been at the barn when she came to find him, dealing with a fence problem that had occupied him and two of the hands all morning. She walked out to the corral fence where he was working and waited for him to finish what he was doing and turned to her, and when he did and saw her expression, he put down the wire tool very slowly. "Julia," he said, "we are going to have a child," she said. "Sometime in November, I think, or perhaps December." The expression on his face moved through several things very quickly. She watched them pass like weather across a clear sky. Shock, which resolved immediately into a deep, radiant joy that she had never seen on him before. Something that might have been fear, very briefly, and then something that was most accurately described as absolute, committed certainty. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and put his arms around her with the careful, fierce tenderness of a man who is very strong and knows exactly what that strength is doing. And she held on to him and felt his face press into her hair, and he held her like that for a long time without saying anything because neither of them needed to. "A child," he said finally, against her hair. "Our child," she said. "God," he said. "God, Julia." She laughed into his shoulder. "I believe that's the most demonstrative I've ever seen you." "Give me a moment," he said, not releasing her. "I'm working on it." She gave him the moment. Then she gave him several more, because she had nowhere in the world she would rather have been. The pregnancy progressed through the summer with the particular physical intensity that Julia had not been warned about in any useful detail, and which she navigated with the combination of stubbornness and pragmatism that characterized her approach to most challenges. She continued working the accounts through August, and Lewis continued asking, with the careful repetition of a man trying not to be overbearing, whether she was taking sufficient rest, and she continued answering him with exactly the same patience she used with the ledgers, which was to say, patient, precise, and firm. Clara Alcott, who had 3 children of her own and considerable opinions on the subject, came to the ranch twice a week through the late summer and sat with Julia and talked about what was coming with the forthright, practical honesty that Julia had come to love about her. Ben Alcott had been sent, on those occasions, to the south pasture on errands that Lewis invented with transparent but well-meaning transparency. "He worries," Clara said one afternoon, watching Lewis through the kitchen window as he found reasons to stay within visual range of the house. "He does," Julia agreed. "It's a good sign," Clara said. "Men who don't worry are men who haven't understood what they have to lose." Julia looked out the window at him. He was talking to one of the hands and pretending not to be watching the house, and she could see, from the specific angle of his shoulders, that he was watching the house. "I know," she said. "I know exactly what I have." The baby arrived on a cold night in the first week of December, 1879, delivered by Caldwell's Dr. Harmon with Clara Alcott's assistance, and Lewis in the hallway outside the bedroom door in a state of controlled terror that Ben Alcott reported, with some amusement later, Was the only time in 15 years of knowing him that he had seen Lewis Conroy lose his composure entirely. The baby was a boy. Lewis came through the door when Dr. Harmon opened it, and he moved to Julia's side and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been shown something he cannot quite fit into the categories of his previous experience: vast, inarticulate, wholly real. "You are extraordinary," he said to her simply. "I noticed," she said, exhausted and radiant. "Do you want to meet your son?" Dr. Harmon placed the baby, wrapped in the soft wool blanket that Julia had made through the late October evenings, in Lewis's arms, and Lewis held him with the instinctive care of a man who understands, immediately and completely, what he is holding. They named him Thomas James Conroy Thomas for the effort of the past, a way of naming what had come before with honesty and without bitterness. James for Lewis's own father, who had died when Lewis was 19, and whom Lewis spoke of with a quiet, sustained grief that she understood was love. Thomas James Conroy arrived in the world on December the 4th, 1879, and he arrived into a house that was ready for him in every sense: warm, stable, filled with the kind of love that does not perform itself, but simply is, present in the quality of every interaction, the care of every decision, the specific gravity of two people who have chosen each other with full and open knowledge of who they are. Lewis sat in the chair by the bed that night and held Tom while Julia slept, and when she woke briefly in the small hours she found him still there, awake, looking at the child in his arms with the expression of a man who has just understood something about his own life that he could not have understood before. "You should sleep," she said. "I will," he said, "in a little while." She watched them, her husband and her son, in the lamplight of the December night, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off the Wichita stage 6 months ago with $43 and a secret, and the bone-deep determination not to be broken by the things that had already happened to her. She thought about the gun in the general store, and the jar of nails, and the man who had walked through the door. She thought about the dinner table at the hotel, and the courtyard of Mrs. Dalloway's boarding house at night, and the cottonwood trees along the creek, and the way Lewis had said "I love you" as though it were a declaration of intent as much as a feeling. She had come to town as a widow. She had left as a cattleman's wife. But those two facts, she knew now, were only the beginning and the ending of a story whose middle was everything, whose middle was, in fact, the entire thing. The years that followed the birth of Thomas James were years of expansion, not in the operatic sense of dramatic events, though there were those too, but in the quieter, more fundamental sense of a life growing into its full dimensions. The ranch grew. The herd increased. The account books that Julia maintained became, by 1881, the financial backbone of a serious cattle operation that employed 16 hands year-round and was known throughout Comanche County as one of the best-managed properties in the region. Lewis bought the eastern parcel, 400 additional acres, in the spring of 1880, a purchase that had been 2 years in the planning, and that Julia had modeled in the accounts with a precision that allowed them to complete the transaction without the kind of debt exposure that could make a bad cattle year catastrophic. He showed her the signed deed with the quiet pride of a man who had always done his best work in partnership. Tom grew into a steady, curious child who had his mother's precision with numbers and his father's silence that was actually, on closer inspection, not silence at all but deep and active engagement. By the time he was 2, he could be found following Lewis around the south pasture with the dedicated focus of a very small researcher. In the fall of 1881, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news arrived in the kitchen at supper, and Lewis received it with none of the shocked stillness of the first time. The architecture of joy was the same but without the structural surprise, which meant it was simply, straightforwardly, joy. "I'm glad," he said. "I know," she said. "Is that all you're going to say?" She asked with the particular teasing quality that had developed between them, the specific, private register of a couple who have spent enough time together that they have their own language. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I love you," he said. "I love this life. I love what we're building, and I'm going to be glad about this for a very long time." She turned her hand in his. "That," she said, "is more than enough." The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1882, and they named her Margaret, after a passage in Lewis's journal that Julia had once found and read, a passage in which he had written about a quality of beauty that he had seen in the Kansas spring, a beauty that was not soft but sharp-edged and unapologetic, and which he had not known how to describe at the time. She was that Margaret Conroy, born May of 1882, with her father's focused eyes and her mother's chin, and a quality of presence from the very first that made everyone in the room with her feel that her attention was both a privilege and a kind of gentle accountability. Lewis held Maggie the way he had held Tom, with that careful, complete attention that was his characteristic gift to the people he loved, and he looked at Julia over the top of his daughter's downy head with an expression of such unguarded fullness that she felt it land in the center of her chest like something warm and permanent. "Two," he said. "Two," she agreed. "We have a family," he said, and the word carried a weight that she knew had history in it. Lewis, who had worked alone for so long, who had built everything through sheer individual will, who had been self-sufficient to such a degree that the idea of needing anyone had been, for years, almost conceptually foreign to him. She had given him the thing he had not known to ask for. He had given her the same. The trouble when it came, because the Wild West did not simply conclude its difficulties once a person had arranged themselves correctly. It continued to present the ongoing challenges of a landscape that was genuinely, fundamentally difficult. Came in the summer of 1882, in the form of a dry summer of unprecedented severity, and a question of range access that put the Conroy property in direct conflict with a neighboring cattle operation run by a man named Douglas Fry. The drought had been building since April, the grass turning from green to straw yellow by June, the creek running lower than Lewis had ever seen it in 15 years on the property, the cattle requiring management and constant movement to keep them on whatever grass remained. It was a hard summer for every rancher in the county, but for Fry, whose property lay to the west without reliable water access, it was potentially catastrophic, and he began pushing his cattle east onto Conroy land with an incrementalism that might, in another man's reading, have been described as accidental, but which Lewis recognized, correctly, as deliberate. Lewis addressed it, as he addressed most things, directly. He rode to Fry's property and had a clear, specific conversation about the boundaries and the prior agreement that had never included summer grazing rights on the Conroy Range. Fry received this conversation with the particular combination of aggrievement and bad faith that characterized his dealings generally, and the situation escalated through July, with increasing tension. Cattle found on the wrong side of the fence with increasing frequency, a fence line cut on 2 occasions, and finally, on a morning in August, 2 of Lewis's hands confronted by 3 of Fry's men in a standoff that had stopped short of violence but only barely. Julia read the situation with the same analytical clarity that she brought to the accounts. She spent 2 evenings with the territorial land records, which she had requested from the county office in Caldwell, using the access she had established through years of legitimate correspondence. And she found, in the original survey documents, a covenant that Fry's predecessor had signed with the Conroy property's prior owner, establishing a specific boundary condition for summer range access. The covenant was binding. It had simply never been cited because until the current drought no one had had occasion to need it. She brought this to Lewis with the document laid flat on the kitchen table, her finger on the relevant paragraph. He read it. He looked at her. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "The original survey bundle from the county office," she said. "I asked for the full package when the water rights question came up 2 years ago. I've had it filed since then." He looked at the document again, and she could see him calculating, not just the legal implication but the larger picture. The document settled the range access question definitively. Fry had no legal basis for the incursions, and with this covenant on record, any attempt to press the matter through the territorial court would fail. "This ends it," he said. "It ends it legally," she said. "Fry still has a drought problem. His cattle still need grass and water." Lewis was quiet for a moment. "I know." Watched him. She knew what he was going to decide. She knew him well enough by now to see the shape of a decision forming in him. "There's the north pasture along the creek," he said slowly. "It's got more water than the south range. We're not running the full herd there. If I offered Fry a temporary summer grazing agreement paid, formal with clear conditions, it solves his immediate problem, and it makes it unambiguous that any presence of his cattle on my land is by agreement only, not by right." She nodded. "It also establishes goodwill in a county where you're going to be working alongside this man for the foreseeable future." "It's the right thing," he said. And then, with the quality of someone who is not asking rhetorically, "What do you think?" "I think it's exactly right," she said. "I can draft the agreement tonight." He covered her hand on the table with his. "We're a good team," he said. "We are," she said. "Now sit down and let me draft it while Tom and Maggie are asleep, or we'll be at this until midnight." He sat down and they worked. And when she looked up an hour later, she found him watching her with an expression that was so entirely without self-consciousness that she had to stop and simply receive it for a moment. The way he looked at her when he was not thinking about whether he was looking. When it was simply true. The grazing agreement with Fry was signed within the week and held through the end of the drought. It did not make Fry a friendly man. He was not, constitutionally, a friendly man. But it settled the matter, and the boundaries remained clear and respected. And the Conroy cattle had their pasture and their water, and the late summer rains came eventually, as they always did, and turned the prairie green again. By the autumn of 1883, Caldwell itself had changed considerably from the cattle trade boomtown of 5 years earlier. The cattle drives through the Kisham Trail were declining. The expansion of the railroad network and the settlement of the southern Kansas range had begun shifting the trade, and Caldwell was in the process of negotiating its own next version of itself. The saloons were quieter. Families had moved in and built up. There were now 3 schools and a second church and a proper hotel with an actual dining room that served more than 4 items. Edwin Barker had sold his store to his nephew and retired to a small house on the north end of town, where he grew tomatoes, and told everyone who visited about the remarkable woman who had organized his accounts so brilliantly that he had more capital when he sold than he had ever expected. Julia had maintained her friendship with Edwin and his wife through the years of the marriage, and she made a point of riding into Caldwell twice a month for the social connections she valued and the business contacts she maintained. She was known in Caldwell by 1883 as Lewis Conroy's wife, but this description, she was pleased to find, was understood by everyone who knew them to be a description of a partnership rather than a possession. The accounts of the Conroy Ranch were known to be her domain as much as Lewis's. Her correspondence on behalf of the cattle company's commercial interests was known to produce results. When disputes or difficulties touched the ranch, people said naturally, "You'll want to talk to Julia," or "You'll want to talk to Lewis," depending on the nature of the problem, and it was a clear and comfortable division of respective expertise. She did not think of herself as famous. She thought of herself as useful, which was more satisfying. On a clear November evening in 1883, 5 years after the night she had arrived in Caldwell on the stage from Wichita, she and Lewis rode out to the eastern boundary of the property, the new parcel that had been theirs for 3 years now, and sat on their horses in the fading light and looked at the land that was theirs together. Tom was 4. Maggie was 18 months. Mrs. Dalloway had come out from town to watch them for the evening, claiming she needed the visit, but transparently understanding that Julia and Lewis needed the air. Clara Alcott had told Julia earlier that week that she thought Julia looked more completely herself than she had ever seen any woman look, which was a sentence that Julia had carried in her pocket like a stone she kept coming back to touch. The land ran flat and then slightly rolling to the east, the autumn grass a deep amber gold in the late light, the sky above it going rose and violet. A nighthawk turned in the air above the pasture. 5 years, Lewis said. 5 years, she agreed. Do you know what I remember most? He said. From the very beginning, she turned to look at him. The light was on the side of his face, and she thought not for the first time that he was a handsome man, not in the conventional theatrical way, but in the way that a landscape is handsome, with the depth and texture of something that has been formed by actual forces over real time. What? She asked. You put that jar down on the counter, he said. After the gun went off. You put it down with this very specific, exact precision, like you were filing something away. And you looked at me and I thought, I have never in my life seen anyone who was more thoroughly present in a moment than this woman is. Not running from it, not pretending it hadn't happened, just completely there. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a very specific memory, she said. I've thought about it many times, he said. He paused. You were the most contained and self-sufficient person I had ever encountered. I was completely terrified of giving you any reason to stop needing anything from me. She felt the laugh before she let it out. Lewis. I'm serious, he said. I know you are, she said. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. I need you, she said. I want to be extremely clear about that, not because I can't function without you. I can. You know I can. But wanting is bigger than needing, and I want you. I want this. I want all of it, Tom and Maggie and the accounts and the pasture and the drought years and the good years and everything in between. I want the life we're making. He held her hand with that familiar, careful strength, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the nighthawk continued turning above the amber grass, and the sky deepened into night around the last rose light at the horizon. I have never been as happy as I am with you, he said. I want you to know that I understand what that means. I don't take it for granted. I know you don't, she said. Neither do I. They stayed until the last light was gone and the stars came out over the Kansas prairie in their thousands, and then they rode home through the dark together, their horses moving in familiar, easy step, to the warm house where their children were sleeping and Mrs. Dalloway was knitting by the fire, and the lamp was burning in the window exactly as it was supposed to be. Time moved in the way it moves when you are living your life rather than merely surviving it, not slowly and not fast, but with the quality of genuine passage, each season distinct, each year adding to the previous ones without erasing them. In 1884, Julia discovered she was expecting a third child. This pregnancy she managed with the accumulated wisdom of the previous two and the increased confidence of a woman who knew her own body and trusted the life she was living. Lewis received the news with the uncomplicated happiness that had become his reliable response to the best developments of his life, quiet, deep, entirely real. The third child was another boy. They named him Robert, after no one in particular, and simply because the name had always had a steadiness to it that suited what he was, a steady, cheerful baby who arrived in the world at dawn on a February morning in 1885 and immediately demonstrated, as Tom had at the same age, a passionate interest in the existence of cattle. Tom, at 5, took his role as older brother with a seriousness that made Lewis laugh and Julia reflect on the genetics of intensity. Maggie, at nearly 3, had opinions about Robert that she expressed in the direct, articulate way she had about everything, and the opinions were, on balance, favorable. The house on the Conroy property, built large, held all of them with room enough that family felt like expansion rather than pressure. Lewis had the kitchen extended in the spring of 1885, which project Julia supervised with the same quality of attention she brought to the cattle accounts, and the result was a kitchen that was both properly functional and, in a way she had not expected but deeply appreciated, genuinely beautiful. A room that held the morning light and the smell of good food, and the sound of 3 children discovering the world. And where she and Lewis sat every evening and talked about the day, and the ranch and the books they were reading, and the plans they were making, and all the ordinary, extraordinary things that constitute a life lived in genuine partnership. She thought sometimes about the woman on the stage from Wichita, the woman with 2 leather trunks and $43 and a carefully maintained exterior of competence behind which something exhausted and afraid was trying very hard to keep its feet. She thought about her with a kind of gentle recognition, not pity, not the patronizing comfort of retrospection, but actual recognition of the courage that it had taken to go forward from that point, to get on the stage, to take the job, to hit the man with the jar of nails, to sit down to dinner with Lewis Conroy and discover, in herself, the capacity to trust again. What she had brought to Caldwell was not in the end a problem to be solved. She had brought herself exactly herself, complete with the hidden debts and the dark past, and the particular combination of stubbornness and intelligence and carefully earned resilience that were her most essential qualities. And Lewis Conroy, who was not a man who wasted time on what was not real, had looked at all of it and said, "Yes, this, here." That was the story she told, to herself, in the quiet moments, to Tom and Maggie when they were old enough to ask about it, to the women who sometimes came to her, over the years, with situations that rhymed with her own, and to whom she offered the specific kind of help that comes from having been there and made it through. You carry what you have and you go forward and you trust when trust is possible, and you hit back when hitting back is what is needed, and you do not confuse self-sufficiency with the refusal to need anyone. Those are different things. She had learned the difference. By the spring of 1886, the Conroy Cattle Company was a fully mature operation, 1,600 head of cattle on 4,400 acres, a staff of 22 that included a trail boss, a head wrangler, 4 year-round ranch hands, a cook, and several seasonal workers at calving and roundup. The accounts showed a clear and consistent profitability that Lewis attributed, in his characteristically straightforward way, to Julia, and that Julia attributed to Lewis's management of the land and cattle, and that everyone who observed them closely attributed correctly to both. Lewis was 42 that spring. Julia was 36. They had been married 8 years, a fact that Lewis acknowledged on their anniversary in September of that year by presenting her, with the self-conscious precision of a man who had spent considerable time on something he felt somewhat awkward about, a small gold bracelet with a single engraved inscription on the inner surface that she had to hold very close to the lamp to read. She read it and looked up at him. "Still the most present person in any room," she read. "It's been true since the first day," he said. His voice was careful in the way it got when he was saying something that mattered very much to him. "I have never once looked at you and found you somewhere else." She held the bracelet in both hands and felt its weight and thought about all the years it represented. The hard ones, the drought summer, the year Tom had been sick with a fever that had lasted 3 weeks, the season the cattle market had dropped sharply enough to require them to renegotiate their credit. The easy ones, though easy was the wrong word, the rich ones, the ones where everything aligned and the land was generous and the accounts were strong and the children were well, and she and Lewis sat on the porch in the evening and there was nothing in any direction that needed fixing. "Thank you," she said. She put the bracelet on her wrist and held it up so the lamplight caught it. "It's beautiful. You are beautiful," he said, with the matter-of-fact directness that was his particular style of romance, no performance, no inflation, just a statement of what was true. She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he leaned into it the way he always did, that small, unguarded inclination of a very self-contained man toward the specific warmth of the specific person who was his. "Come and sit with me," she said. He sat and she sat with him, and the evening settled around them in the way the best evenings did, quietly, with the weight of something that had been earned and was now, permanently and irrevocably, theirs. The fourth child came in 1887. Another boy born in July of that year, in the heat of the Kansas summer, healthy and loud in the way that suited a ranch where the nearest neighbors were several miles away, and volume was not a particular social liability. They named him Henry, for the simple reason that it was a name they both liked and that sat well in the sequence. Tom, Maggie, Robert, Henry, a litany of specific, real individuals. Lewis held Henry in the first hours, and Tom, who was 8 years old and took his responsibilities as eldest with grave seriousness, stood at Lewis's elbow and studied the new baby with the careful assessment of a future ranch manager. "He's smaller than I expected," Tom said. "He'll grow," Lewis said. "He's going to be loud," Tom said with the authority of 8 years' experience. "He already is," Lewis said. Julia, watching them from the bed where she was recovering, felt something move through her that was so complete it was almost beyond language. This was the life. This room, this man, these children, this land outside the window where the summer light was going golden over the pasture, and the cattle were somewhere on the south range, and the kitchen smelled of the supper Clara Alcott had left when she had departed with the particular tact of a true friend. This was the thing that had been worth all of it. She had come to that general store in Caldwell as a woman at the absolute edge of what she could hold together alone. She had come in her widow's black with her back straight and her jaw set, and the determination of someone who has decided that whatever happens next, she will not be the one who fails to try. And the world, which does not always reward trying, but sometimes does, had given her this. Lewis looked up from Henry and Tom and met her eyes across the room, and she saw in his face the same recognition, this consciousness of what they had, the complete and unhurried gratitude for it. "All right?" he asked quietly. "Better than all right," she said. He smiled, and the four of them, Tom still conducting his grave assessment of his youngest brother, Henry announcing his views to the ceiling with considerable force, Lewis with his steady hands and his full attention, were caught for a moment in the amber light of the July evening, and Julia felt time slow to something almost still, the way a good photograph captures a moment in its truest form. She fastened her fingers around the gold bracelet on her wrist and held onto the moment for as long as she could. The autumn of 1887 brought the school question back to the forefront. The Caldwell school, which had been adequate for town children, was too far for the ranch children to attend in the winter months, and there were now 6 families in the area south of Caldwell whose children needed something closer. Julia, who had been teaching Tom and Maggie their lessons in the evenings, organized a meeting at the Alcott property in October and proposed the establishment of a small community school in a building on the Conroy property's north parcel, which was centrally located for the families involved. Lewis donated the building and the materials. The Alcotts and 3 other families contributed the labor for the construction over 2 weekends in November. A teacher, a young woman from Lawrence named Miss Elspeth Carey, who came with a substantial education, and the kind of patient, intelligent energy that children respond to instinctively, arrived in December. Tom started at the school in January of 1888. Maggie, at 6, sat in on lessons with a focused intensity that Miss Carey identified immediately as exceptional. Robert, at 3, informed everyone who would listen that he intended to attend school as soon as he was allowed, and was held to the patient conviction that his time would come. Julia sat on the school board that was established to oversee and fund the operation, and in that capacity she became, gradually, without particularly seeking it, a figure of some consequence in the social and civic life of the southern Comanche County community. She was not a woman who performed influence. She simply applied the same clear-eyed, precise attention to community questions that she applied to everything else. And people who observed this over time came to understand that when Julia Conroy had something to say, it was worth hearing. Lewis watched all of this with the particular pride of a man who has always known what he has and is continually gratified to see it confirmed by other people's recognition. "You're going to be running this county by 1895, he said one evening. "I have no interest in running anything," she said. "I'm just trying to make sure the school has adequate textbooks, and the water access dispute for the Western families, and the proposed new road to Caldwell. Someone has to think about these things," she said, or he said, "and it seems to be you." She gave him the look that she used for statements of the obvious, and he received it with the steady, contained amusement that was his characteristic response to being teased by someone he loved. The years continued to accumulate with the reliable, vital weight of years that are being genuinely lived. The children grew. The ranch prospered through good seasons and survived the harder ones. The community around them deepened in connection and complexity. Caldwell itself continued to evolve. By the early 1890s, it was a fully fledged small city with a rail connection and a proper bank, and a newspaper that covered not just local crime and weather but agriculture and territory politics, and the national questions that were increasingly present even in the farthest reaches of the Kansas plain. Julia read the newspaper every morning. So did Lewis. They argued about it sometimes, not with heat, but with the engaged, specific argumentation of people who are both genuinely interested in being right and deeply accustomed to the possibility that the other person might have the better point. Their arguments were among her favorite things about the marriage, the quality of respect in them, the willingness to be changed by a good argument. She had changed Lewis's mind about water rights management and the optimal timing of the fall cattle sale. He had changed her mind about the southwestern fence line, and more significantly, about the question of whether to push the cattle operation to further expansion or to consolidate and deepen the quality of what they already had. He had been right about the consolidation. She had acknowledged this with the straightforwardness that she applied to all important acknowledgments, and he had received it with the equal straightforwardness that made their partnership work. In 1891, Tom at 12 was already more competent on horseback than most of the ranch hands and had begun, with Lewis's quiet guidance, to understand the cattle, their behavior, their health, the reading of grass, and whether that a good cattleman carries as a second instinct. Maggie at 9 was the best student Miss Carey had ever taught and had begun, of her own initiative, to keep her own small ledger of observations about the natural world around the ranch. Robert at 6 had the easy physical confidence of a boy who had grown up surrounded by large animals and wide sky. And Henry, at 4, was the loudest and most sociable of the four, always at the center of whatever was happening, always convinced that everyone present was glad he was there, which everyone generally was. Julia looked at her 4 children on a morning in October of 1891 and thought about the $43 and the 2 leather trunks. She thought about Thomas Rhodes's debts and the gun in the general store, and the 7 months of careful, solitary survival that had delivered her to the door of Edwin Barker's general store on a June morning in 1878. She thought about Lewis walking through that door. The hidden motive in all of her careful movement through those months had been, she understood now in a way she had not been able to fully articulate then, exactly this: not safety in the legal sense, not financial security in the narrow sense, but this: the specific weight of a life that was genuinely and completely hers. Not the version that had been arranged for her, not the version she had been assigned by the accident of her first marriage, but the version she had walked toward with her eyes open and her jar of nails in her hand. Lewis came out of the barn and walked toward the house where she was standing on the porch watching the morning. He walked the way he had always walked, without swagger, without performance, with the particular ground-covering economy of a man who has somewhere real to go. He saw her watching him, and his expression shifted in that small, specific way that it still shifted after 13 years when he saw her. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her and looked out at the October morning, the pasture gold and the sky a clean, cold blue, and the children visible in 3 different directions doing 3 different things with complete independent focus. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the morning light of their ranch on the Kansas prairie and watched their children moving through the world that they had made together. She was not the widow who had arrived in Caldwell anymore. She was not the woman who had come running from a dead man's debts or hiding from the consequences of a life she had not chosen. She was Julia Conroy, wife, mother, partner, the woman who ran the accounts and organized the school and occasionally organized the county and never, ever put down a jar of nails without knowing where she had put it. She was Lewis Conroy's quietly devoted wife. But the quietly devoted part, that phrase, if anyone had ever applied it to her, was not a description of dimness or reduction. It was a description of choice, of the particular powerful thing that happens when someone who is entirely capable of surviving alone looks at the life they have and decides, "This is where I give my whole self, not because I must, but because this, exactly this, is what devotion is for." "Tom's asking about the spring roundup," Lewis said. "He's 12, she said. "I know." "He can go," she said. "Ben Alcott will be there, and you." "You're sure? He's a Conroy," she said. "He's been sure since he was 3 years old." Lewis made a sound of agreement that contained, she knew, both pride and the residual protective anxiety that never fully left him when it came to the children. She understood that about him. She understood most things about him, after all this time, with the thoroughness of intimate knowledge, not the knowledge that flattens a person but the knowledge that sees them in full, the difficult parts alongside the extraordinary ones. She took his hand where it rested on her shoulder. "We've done well," she said. "We have," he said, "you more than me. That's not true and you know it. You're a remarkable woman, Julia. You're a remarkable man, Lewis." He turned his head to look at her and she looked back at him, and between them in the October morning was everything they had built, the children, the land, the accounts, the arguments, the hard years, the good years, the particular joy of being known completely by someone who has chosen you completely over and over through every version of every year. "I would do it all again," he said, "every bit of it." She tightened her hand on his. "So would I," she said, "starting with the jar of nails." He laughed, that low, warm, real laugh that she had first heard in the general store on a June morning in 1878, and that she intended, with everything she had and everything she was, to go on hearing for the rest of her life. The morning opened before them. The children called out to each other across the October pasture. The cattle moved on the distant range. The sky held everything wide and clean and blue, the way Kansas sky is on the best mornings, as though it has decided, for today at least, to give everything it has. Julia Rhodes had come to Caldwell as a widow. Julia Conroy stood on the porch of her home on a clear October morning with her husband's arm around her and 4 children in the yard and 1,600 cattle on 4,400 acres of Kansas grassland. And she was, in every sense that mattered, exactly where she was supposed to be. The arrow of her life had traveled its full distance. It had found its mark. And it held there steady, certain, brilliantly alive, in the heart of everything she had chosen and been given and made and kept. The story was complete. It was hers, every last word of it.